Good evening. Glad you could join us. I'm Paul Carice. I'm the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and we're delighted to have you at the third event in the school's speaker series this year. The series this year is on the theme of renewing America's civic compact. This is the school's 5th year organizing a public speakers program we call the Civic Discourse Project. And we have been delighted this fall to return to in-person events, so thank you for being here and helping us to rebuild civic discourse. As we return to in-person events, we're also very glad to be partnering again with Arizona PBS. They're recording these events, they're live streaming them. Eventually you can find archived versions of the Civic Discourse Project events on their website and on our website. We encourage you to check out the SCETL website at SCETL at ASU.edu, which has information about our academic programs, degree programs, as well as further information about the Civic Discourse Project. On the theme of civic discourse, I'm happy to see out in the audience, I know we have with us tonight several leaders from the Arizona political and civic community, several distinguished colleagues from other academic units at ASU. I'll just mention briefly, we have with us Eileen Klein, the former president of the Arizona Board of Regents. We have, I can see out now in the audience, the dean of the O'Connor College of Law. We have some senior staff member from the Board of Regents, someone from the Chamber of Commerce, leaders from the Arizona legal community. We worked for 5 years to build a speakers program that brings together a diverse group of people from the ASU community and the broader community on this theme of civil disagreement and civic discourse. We hope the students in particular here will get some information on the table outside about our academic programs, which try to feature that same spirit in our classrooms. And now to briefly introduce our distinguished speaker, Jonathan Rauch. He's very interested in these themes of civic discourse and intellectual diversity and civil disagreement, and he discusses them and many other important topics in his new book, The Intellectual Foundations of These Themes, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, published earlier this year by Brookings Institution Press. And the book recounts that he began his career as a news reporter, a journalist, and he's now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. in its Government Studies program. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He's authored 8 books and many articles in his distinguished career on public policy, on culture, and on government. He's also received the magazine industry's 2 leading prizes, the National Magazine Award, which is their equivalent of the Pulitzer, and the National Headliner Award. I'll add that Jonathan grew up in Phoenix, and he's recounted to me his fondness and regard for a neighbor he knew growing up, who was very kind to him, Mrs. O'Connor, he called her. She was becoming a prominent figure in Arizona politics and then eventually the national affairs. And we are grateful that he is continuing his connection with the Valley and establishing a new connection with ASU and with our school. He spent a week with us as a visiting scholar in the school, did several events with our students, with faculty, and with faculty from other units here at ASU. So our format tonight is that Jonathan has about 40-45 minutes of slides and a presentation. And then in part 2 of the program, I will interview him. Very aggressive on civil questions, I expect. And then in the third part, Jonathan will take questions from the audience. We hope everyone will stay for reception after that. So with that, please join me for Jonathan's discussion of rescuing reality. Can Americans have shared facts again? Join me in welcoming Jonathan Rauch.
What a privilege to be with you today. This is, I think, maybe my second in-person event for over a year and a half, and I can't imagine a better place to do it than coming home to Phoenix, Arizona. I grew up not far from here, spent many hours in the ASU Hayden Library as a debater in Camelback High School. Deep gratitude to Paul and to Carol McNamara for making me at home here on my second visit to SCETL, and I hope not my last. And there's some old friends in the audience. Pat is here from Camelback High School, and I especially want to call out my friend Paul Gerlach, who taught me advanced American history in 11th grade. Paul is a reminder to all of us how much we owe our teachers, especially our great teachers. Paul may not remember this, but sometime in the first semester of that class, he called me up after class. I had submitted some kind of paper, and he said, "Mr. Rauch, did you write this?" And I allowed that I had. And he said, "I mean by yourself." And I allowed that I had. And after overcoming a certain amount of skepticism, he said that he thought I had something of a talent for writing, and here I am. So thank you, Paul Gerlach, and thank you all. The title of this talk, "Can we have a shared set of facts," is a little bit of a feint, because of course Americans never have had and never will have a completely shared set of facts. 40% believe in demonic possession, 25% believe in astrology. That's nothing new. It's not even bad. You need diversity of opinion to drive the knowledge-making process forward. But you can get in situations where disagreement becomes so rife on issues that directly affect public policy that a country becomes borderline ungovernable, or indeed ungovernable. And to that effect, a new term has emerged in just the last 3 or 4 years, a term that we have never used to see in American politics: epistemic crisis. Here's Barack Obama speaking about a year ago. "If we do not have the capacity to distinguish what's true from what's false, then by definition, the marketplace of ideas doesn't work, and by definition, our democracy doesn't work. We are entering into an epistemological crisis." Many people have said the same thing, but what do they mean? What are we talking about when we say, I call it epistemic crisis? It's not just ordinary disagreement. It's something like this. It's a breakdown or a disruption of a society's epistemic constitution, meaning its social system for settling differences of belief and building a shared public reality. It is very hard to solve the problem in any large society of what is true and what is false. Standard way throughout history has been people disagree about this, form themselves into sects, tribes, cults, and then go to war with each other, or an authoritarian ruler, a priest, a prince, a politburo, an oracle, takes charge and puts everyone who disagrees in jail. It's a massive, massive social problem. How do you know when you're in an epistemic crisis? Symptoms involve things like, for example, rampant polarization, chilling, where people are afraid to speak out, cynicism, where people don't know what's true or don't in fact believe that anything is true, false consensus, forking realities, where you begin to get division into competing cults, really live in different worlds, leading ultimately, potentially, to ungovernability and even potentially to civil war. We're in something a little bit like that now. I'm not the only person to think so. Here's an example. I think it's the most important and pressing example. Depending on the poll you look at, 60 to 70% of Republicans today believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election and that it was stolen. Just yesterday, Politico and Morning Consult released a poll showing that 60% of Republicans think that the existing government should be overthrown and Donald Trump should be restored to power right now. Now, we talk about dueling realities. What do we mean? Ask people the question, who is very or somewhat responsible for the events that led to the January 6th Capitol attack? You see what Republicans say there on the left. The majority of them, about 51%, blame Democrats in Congress. The runner-up is Joe Biden. Donald Trump is a distant third at 30%. That is very different from the rest of the country, which you can see on the right, where blame is clearly allocated by a large margin to Donald Trump. And remember, this is the whole country. It includes Republicans. If you were to subtract Republicans from this number, you get a much higher and starker difference. Here's another sign of epistemic crisis: widespread chilling. This is one of a lot of polling questions, which all come out in the same ballpark, 60–65% range. The political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive. These are people feeling chilled, socially coerced, reluctant to speak out for fear of consequences. It's over 60% agree with that. Among college students, it's about 2/3. Sociologists who study this, one study, it's very hard to compare, it's hard to get good numbers, but they guessed that this is approximately 4 times the level of chilling that we saw at the height of the McCarthy era in the early 50s. And my guess, it's only a conjecture, but my conjecture is the reason for that, is in the McCarthy era, people knew what it was unsafe to say. If you stayed away from communism, you were probably all right. At this moment, people don't know what's unsafe to say because the standards change by the day. We'll see why in about 15 minutes. Here's an especially significant question, I think. Are you worried about losing your job or missing out on job opportunities if your political opinions become known? Now, this relates to what's become known as cancel culture, which I think is a real thing, and one of its primary modus operandi is to go after people's jobs, their professional contacts, their careers, their reputations, so that anytime anyone Googles that person when they're applying for a job in the future, Google says they've been accused of racism, sexism, homophobia, and there are always other people you can hire instead. Now notice that about 1/3 of the country is now worried about speaking out for fear of lost opportunity. And it's all the way across the spectrum. It is not only conservatives, very liberal, same thing. Mass chilling across the board. So what's going on here? I want to leave you with 3 ideas. And here they are. Number 1, it's not a marketplace of ideas, it's a constitution of knowledge. It's a big difference. We need to know what that means and how to defend it. Number 2, you're being manipulated. Number 3, they're not 10 feet tall, we are. At least we are, if we rouse to our own defense. If you ask most Americans today where knowledge comes from, they will usually say from the marketplace of ideas. It's a great metaphor. I love it. I use it. It's important. It dates back, the ideas date back to John Stuart Mill in the mid-19th century. The actual formulation dates to 102 years ago. Oliver Wendell Holmes, in the case of Abrams versus US. Best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. But if you ask a smart undergraduate about the marketplace of ideas, they will ask you, so wait a minute, how do we know that the marketplace of ideas will surface truth instead of garbage? What if what people want is garbage? And it turns out to be a very important and profound question, because left to its own devices, the marketplace of ideas looks like this. If it has no structure, it devolves very quickly into posturing, tribalism, outrage, attention-seeking, trolling, all the things that we see on social media, which is unstructured, and there is a reason for that. Humans are wired very well to survive in the environment for which we evolved, basically small tribes roaming the savannah. Large societies, though, that need a grasp of abstract truths, questions like what is causing the malady that is killing our children, which God should we worship? These are not questions that we are very good at solving left to our own devices. We are absolutely riddled with cognitive and psychological biases that distort not only what we believe about the world, but even how we perceive the world. I've listed a handful of them here. We won't go into them. There are dozens and dozens more. Unfortunately, they don't come out in the wash. They don't cancel each other out. In many cases, they're additive and lead to cognitive spirals. The most prominent of them, kind of master of all the others, is confirmation bias. And that is our tendency to seek out and more rapidly assimilate information which is agreeable to us, whether because it raises our status in the group, or tells us a narrative about ourselves which we prefer to believe, or is in tune with our pre-existing beliefs, which we don't want to change, or confirms our identity. Now, confirmation bias affects not only what we believe, but psychological experiments actually show it affects what we see. It actually affects our perceptions, and so does something else, another very important source of bias. Conformity bias. Now this is a social bias. You would think that the way human cognition works is first input comes first through our eyes, then to our brain, and then to society around us, to our group. Very often, it actually turns out to work the other way. First, there's the group, based on what the group believes, that is filtered through the brain. Then at last, it winds up at the eyes. We actually are more likely to perceive what the group says it perceives. And that makes some sense, actually, because out there in the wild, in the evolutionary environment, if we're not in harmony with what others perceive and believe, we could get thrown out of the group, which means probably we die. Also, more likely than not, if there's a disagreement, the group is likely to be right. We're likely to be wrong. So our brains will tell us to go along with others. Now, whoops. There we are. Some of you have seen this. Raise your hand or nod your head if you've seen this. Yeah, very well known. This is one of the most famous and widely replicated social science experiments of all time. 1951, Solomon Asch, cognitive psychologist, takes 8 people, puts them in the room, gives them what he says is going to be a vision test. The question is, which line on the right most closely matches the line on the left? Raise your hand if you think the answer is A. Raise your hand if you think it's B. Raise your hand if you think it's C. All the hands go up, and indeed, if you just hand this to someone and ask them to do it, they always get it right. So you put 8 people in the room and you ask them that question, but there's a catch. 7 of the 8 people in the room are actors, and they are all going to say, one after another, with a sense of certainty about it, confidence, the answer is B. The 8th person in the room is the actual experimental subject. What will they say when everyone else in the room is claiming to see that B matches the target line? The answer is, in a third of trials, the experimental subject conforms with the group rather than picking the obviously correct choice. When debriefed about this, some people say they knew the correct choice but weren't willing to say it. Others say they just became unsure. Maybe it's an optical illusion. Maybe other people were seeing something they weren't. 75% of the subjects conform in at least one trial, which means only 25% always buck the group and pick the right answer. Now, we're going to see in a minute why this is important, but for now, let's just notice how conformity bias and confirmation bias become a vicious spiral. We associate with groups that tend to conform our biases because we're seeking bias confirmation. Bias confirmation in terms changes what we see, what we report back to the group, and now you've got a spiral. You get epistemic secession and division and tribalism and sectarianism as these groups go down their specific reality rabbit holes, and that's how you get a phenomenon like, for example, Jonestown. So what do we do about this? Well, you need these guys, you need freedom of speech, but they're not enough. You need someone else. That's this guy. Who is he? Yeah, you know, this is James Madison, the father of the Constitution. He's the guy who gets us from this, the Declaration of General Principles about freedom, to this, a specific social system of norms, institutions, and rules which force us to compromise and behave in ways that allow for rational political outcomes. A very hard thing to do. So I'm about to skip right past what I think is the most important section of the thinking of constitutional knowledge, which is explaining how that Constitution works, and in fact why this is not just a metaphor, a simile, a figure of speech. There literally is a Constitution of knowledge. It doesn't happen to be written down, as the US Constitution is, and there's no Supreme Court. Neither of those things matter very much, though, because both are sets of codified social rules that incentivize our behavior in ways that are pro-social and constructive. They have a lot in common. These two systems are doing very similar kinds of things. They both use checks and balances. One pits ambition against ambition. The other pits cognitive bias against cognitive bias. I don't see my biases, you don't see your biases, but you can see mine and I can see yours. And if we're forced to deal with each other, then number 2, the system compels social negotiation. In the political constitution, that's compromise. In the epistemic constitution, that's persuasion. We all have to persuade other people that we're right, and those people have to be strangers. They can't just be our friends and tribe. The result is that you distribute authority, you prevent any one faction from seizing control. Millions and millions, if not billions of people can be part of this social negotiation, and you've imposed impersonal rules. No one in particular is in charge. No priest, prince, politburo, no other thing beginning in P is in a position to say, here's what we believe, and you have to believe it too. Finally, something they also both have in common, Madison's system is a hybrid. It's got direct input from voters, ordinary people. It's also got professional politicians, representative government, and you need both. Constitution of knowledge does the same thing. Of course, we can all input ideas, that's freedom of speech. But we also have professionals, scholars, journalists, lawyers, government officials, places like CIA, government statistical agencies, that do the actual hard work on a day-to-day basis of figuring out what's true and what's false, which is a very hard thing to do. When you put all this together, you get something amazing. You get a global network that uses impersonal rules to hunt for error, what I call the reality-based community, with apologies to Karl Rove. Reality-based community. What's that? Well, here's an example. We're in the heart of it right now, a great American university. It is doing research. It is transmitting to the next generation the tools of thinking for how to do research. It is advancing knowledge. But there's much, much more to the reality-based community. There are great universities, research centers like NIH, think tanks like my own Brookings, government agencies like the Weather Bureau, intelligence agencies, CIA, for example, Supreme Court. The notion of a fact does not come originally from science. It predates modern science. It comes from law. Because it turned out that you needed a common set of facts in order to be able to adjudicate stuff. And if you don't believe the courts are fact-based and fact-seeking, ask Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, any of the others who brought 60-plus lawsuits that were completely frivolous challenging the election. They got nowhere in court because they didn't have facts on their side. Plus, you have the academic conferences. You have the panels, like this one, where Paul will brutally question me. You have the newsrooms, hubs of information, where every day dozens of reporters bring in hundreds of tips, bring them to editors, figure out what's news, what isn't, what's worth transmitting, what needs to be held back and checked or thrown out. You've got the professional societies and organizations. These, it turned out, were the critical point in the process of creating modern science. These are the places that decide what are the professional rules and standards, how do you credential people, how do you connect them, what is it we're actually doing. These are the organizations, for instance, that created modern medicine out of what until then had been a disaggregated bunch of folk healers. You've got the journals, of course. Some of them are academic. Many are like The Economist, which I work for, The Atlantic, which I work for. And then there are these, the prizes. This is also an important piece. You see here the Pulitzer and the Nobel. But there are many smaller incentives in the system. Things like if you're a scholar, you want to be cited. If you're a journalist, you want your story to be picked up by others. If you're an intelligence officer, you want to get into the president's daily brief. If you're a lawyer, you want your decision, your brief cited by a court. The reason it's important that these are positive incentives, as we'll see, is this. What this system is doing is seeking error. But the raw material, the fuel for this system, is error itself. The key to science is not that it doesn't make mistakes, it's that it makes them incredibly quickly, millions and millions of them a day, and it uses this global hive mind network to sort through the errors, figure out where the truth is. Well, you want people to make mistakes, which means the price of making mistakes cannot be that you lose your livelihood, your career, your professional connections, even your life. That's how it was typically done in the past. So what's instead the price? You lose the argument. So how do you keep people honest in this system? You reward them. The result is that we kill our hypotheses instead of each other, as the great philosopher Karl Popper said. This is a revolutionary idea in human history because until quite recently, typically if we wanted to kill the hypothesis, we kill the person. The result of this system is a massive hive hive mind, millions of individuals, experts, professionals, and institutions all over the world, all developing knowledge, expanding at a rapid clip. The big new thing that's happening is developing countries, China and India, many others are coming online, bringing new expertise, new perspectives. This thing just grows and grows. And it is a transformative social technology because it produces in a morning, I can't prove this, but I think it's true, it produces in the morning more new knowledge than humanity produced over its entire first 200,000 years. What it's producing is something that is tangible and actually exists, with all due respect to postmodernists, and that's objective knowledge. And here's a picture of objective knowledge. If you drop it on your foot, it will hurt. It is a real thing. It will outlive human beings. It exists independently of human beings, although we originally made it. If all of humans died off, and 1 million years from now, aliens came and discovered and decoded our databases and libraries, they could immediately put all of that knowledge to work. And I know that. It has been scientifically proven because, as you all know, in the 3rd season of Star Trek, episode 8, McCoy has an incurable disease which is cured at the end of the show because the Enterprise discovers the cure in the databanks of a robot spaceship from a dead civilization.
Captain, intelligence files. Their banks contain the total knowledge of the Fabrini, ready for the people to consult when they arrive at their destination. And they seem to have amassed a great deal of medical knowledge.
You can't do this without quoting Star Trek. It's so awesome. But if that does not persuade you as a truth, as a proof text, here's my husband Michael getting the shot that is protecting him and me, and I hope all of you, from COVID right now. The system we have was able to pivot billions of dollars, hundreds of institutions, probably tens or hundreds of thousands of minds within a matter of days to decode the genome of this new virus, within a few more days to design on paper a new vaccine and get it distributed in less than a year. This is, as I said, a species-transforming technology. Point number 2, you're being manipulated. So the constitution of knowledge has always had enemies. It always will. This began day 1. Galileo, in prison. Dogmatists who believe that they're fundamentally right and don't want to tolerate other points of view, do not like it. Demagogues and dictators who find facts inconvenient, do not like it. Many other people find it disorienting because it doesn't give you solid ground to stand on. It questions everything. It seems like truth is always changing. Objective knowledge is always changing. For those reasons and others, there have always been enemies. I want to focus on the 2 that I think are most prominent right now, and the second half of my book is devoted to talking about. I want to talk about what specialists call information warfare, sometimes also propaganda. I think of it as epistemic warfare. What is that? This is organizing and manipulating the social and media environment for political advantage. In other words, it's manipulating the cognitive and epistemic environment that we live in to deceive us, divide us, disorient us, and ultimately, the end product sought, demoralize us. Demoralization is demobilization. If we don't know what's true, who to trust, difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth, or if we're deeply divided as a society, or if we're deceived, ultimately we become demoralized and ineffective. And that is what our manipulators are seeking. There are lots of ways to do this. We won't talk about all of them. I'm going to focus mainly on 2, but I've listed some. What they have in common is that they weaponize the kind of cognitive vulnerabilities that we were talking about earlier. Trolling, that's attention hijacking, forcing us to pay attention whether we want to or not. Canceling, we're going to see more about that in a minute. Conspiracy theories. Repetition, this is a classic one. Cognitive flaw, if you say something again and again and again, simple familiarity will drive it in and people will start to think it just might be true. They'll forget where they heard it. They'll think, oh, that sounds credible because I hear it a lot. And finally, one that RAND researchers have called the fire hose of falsehood, which I'll dwell on for a moment. This is Stephen Bannon. He was an advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign, and then he worked in the White House until he got fired. And this is a famous quotation he gave to Michael Lewis, the journalist. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. You could not, if you were a technical philosopher, come up with a more accurate way to describe a very sophisticated tactic pioneered by the Russians, who are the real master of this thing, or were until recently. I'm going to let Yuri Bessmanov, a senior KGB defector, describe it. This is from a tape I got off of YouTube in 1983. Our time is short, but it is worth listening to the next 75 seconds and asking yourself, does any of this sound familiar in today's context?
But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process, which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. Exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures.
People don't know what to believe anymore, even if you shower them with facts and information, they throw up their hand. Does that sound familiar? Try telling people who are anti-vaxxers, shower them with information, or the many undecided people who no longer know what to believe. Stop the steal. What's true? What's false? I don't know who to trust. Here's an example of Russians putting this to work. This is Sergei Skripal and his daughter. In 2018, the Putin government attempted to assassinate them using a sophisticated Russian nerve agent called Novichok. The Russians, when called on this, had an explanation. In fact, they had a lot of explanations. Among their explanations were these: Britain poisoned them, Ukraine poisoned them, it was an accident, no, it was a suicide, no, it was a revenge killing. No, it was not a nerve agent. Well, yes, it was a nerve agent, but Russia didn't produce a nerve agent, but no, actually it was a different nerve agent. And so forth and so on. This is not about deceiving people with a lie. It's about, as the Washington Post says, you fling up swarms of falsehoods, concocted theories, red herrings, intended not so much to persuade people as to bewilder them. Bewildered people are demoralized, demoralized people are demobilized. Who else does this? Now, some of you may be made uncomfortable by the next 7 minutes or so of my presentation, because it will strike you as politically partisan. I can tell you I am among the least partisan people you have ever met. I consider myself center-right. I have admired and voted for many Republicans. What I'm telling you is the facts as I see them. But you'll have to make up your own mind about that. 2016-11. Politifact goes through and rates the factual claims made by both candidates. This is as of July, but the numbers didn't change in October. Hillary Clinton, 26% of what she says is mostly or entirely false. That's too much, but it means 75% is mostly or entirely true. That's kind of what we expect of the politician in the heat of a campaign. Donald Trump, 71%, mostly or entirely false. If the man is opening his mouth, he is probably lying. We have never seen anything like that before in American politics. You might think, okay, well, he's a sociopath, he's having fun, he doesn't care, he's a nihilist. I don't think so. I think he knows what he's doing, and I think he knew what he was doing when his very first 2 acts as president were telling a falsehood about the size of the crowd during his campaign and whether it rained. 2 facts which anyone with eyes could see he was misstating, and that's the point. not to persuade you, but to disorient you, to say, I'm in charge of the facts, anything I say goes, and I can say anything I want. And thus we have, for the first time in history, many incidents like this. This is the President of the United States using a Sharpie pen to alter the predicted course of a hurricane. Here's the 4-year record. According to the Washington Post total, 30,573 false or misleading claims. That number is approximately 20 a day. Now that's not an accident, folks. That looks to me and a lot of other people like a fire hose of falsehood disinformation campaign where you're just putting out so much garbage so quickly that the fact checkers and the media can't keep up because every time they knock one down, 3 or 4 more come to replace it and the public throws up its hands, not knowing what to believe. And look at the shape of that curve, would you? Look at what happens in 2020. About toward the latter half of the year, you get that sudden increase. What do you all think that is? Election. That stopped the steal. In April and May of 2020, Trump begins putting out the word that mail-in ballots are going to steal the election. People like me, political people at Brookings, we all scratch our heads and say, why would he do that? Old people, it's a pandemic, old people vote by mail, they tend to be Republicans, and so what's going on with that? Well, it turns out he's not targeting the election. He's targeting the day after the election. He is priming a network and a message which he's going to activate on November 4th to spread a massive disinformation campaign that the election was stolen. So, this is his Twitter account. This is December 10th. Here's December 30th. Every day looks like that. He's pouring out the lie that the election was stolen. So are Republican politicians, conservative media. They're even using the courts. And they come up with other creative ways to do this. This is the Arizona Memorial Coliseum, Veterans Memorial Coliseum, where I saw many a Suns game as a kid. This is pure propaganda theater. There was no need for an audit, much less a partisan audit run by a very bizarre group of people called cyber ninjas. The goal here was to cast doubt on the election and then replicate this across the country with propaganda theater. Strangely, the cyber ninjas find the election wasn't stolen. What happens then? First, Trump gives a speech saying what the cyber ninjas found is, guess what? That the election was stolen. Classic disinformation. And then he does this. Okay, not Maricopa County, Pima County was stolen. We're going to start all over again. Again, flood the zone with shit. That's how you get here. 75%, 70%, whatever, Republicans believing the election was stolen. A plurality of independents saying we'll never know who won the 2020 election. What we're seeing here is a devastatingly audacious, ambitious, and effective campaign of Russian-style mass disinformation adapted and weaponized to target Americans for the first time in American politics. The best way to cope with this kind of sophisticated cognitive warfare is not to do it in the first place. Liberal democracies have a very hard time with that. Unfortunately, it is out there. Time is short, so I'll move more quickly through this second one, but it relates to universities, and that's what people call cancel culture. It's a man named Brandon Ike. He's appointed CEO of Mozilla Internet Company 2014. Some people find out that 6 years earlier he had donated $1,000 to Proposition 8, an anti-gay marriage referendum in California. They mount a big internet campaign. They say he's got to be fired. Basically overnight, here's what happens. He steps down, Mozilla issues an apology, we're sorry, we must do better. At the time, I and a lot of other people, including gay marriage activists, who spoke out in a public letter against this firing, thought, well, okay, this is a bad thing. We didn't expect to see much more of it. Little did we know that we were seeing the debut of a different kind of disinformation tactic, which is the use of social coercion, weaponized through social media, but also personal networks, places on university campuses, like protests, like using course evaluations, demanding investigations. Here's a famous example. This is David Shore. He's actually a Democratic left-leaning political analyst a year ago, a bit more. He tweets out an accurate description of a survey, of a study, academic study, actually by an African American. This becomes the basis of a cancel campaign, as you can see on the upper right. They target his employer, come get your boy. He tries the apology method. I regret starting this conversation and will be much more careful moving forward. Doesn't help, he's fired. Another famous example, this is a guy driving down the street. He's a workman with San Diego Gas and Electric. He's cracking his knuckles. Someone sees this, puts it on social media, says that he is targeting people with a white supremacist hand sign. He's fired the next day. Now, there are many other examples, and they result in this. Some people say cancel culture isn't real. It's just, whiny elites who don't like to be criticized. Well, I give you this, and many other polls like it. People don't know what it's safe to say anymore without dangerous social consequences. Now, there are two results of this. One is simply chilling effect, because people don't know what to say, old-fashioned self-censorship. But another is more profound and subtle. Remember that Ash experiment. Remember that if you can manipulate the apparent consensus in the room, you can change not only what people say, but even to some extent what they believe and even see. Which allows small groups of activists, if they can dominate the consensus, to make other people think, well, maybe I'm wrong. These groups, these activist groups look formidable. On places like campuses, really surprisingly small numbers of activists can manipulate the perceived consensus so that they look 10 feet tall. Others are reluctant to speak out and often think maybe they're shameful and just wrong. They lose confidence in their position. They become demoralized. Demoralization is demobilization. They're not 10 feet tall. We are. I'm getting a 5-minute sign. I might need 7. They're not 10 feet tall. We are. So people say my book is optimistic, and I kind of like that, but I think of it instead as hopeful. Because the statement, they're not 10 feet tall, we are, is a conditional statement. I believe that if we understand and defend the Constitution of knowledge, we win. In fact, we win handsomely. This is not the first time in the last 300 years that we have seen massive and sophisticated attacks on the Constitution of knowledge. Others, in fact, were more formidable. For example, the Catholic Church, when it was at its peak. But this thing is not self-defending. It is not organic. It does not run on autopilot. Free speech is not enough. It's like the US Constitution. You have to be civically literate to understand what's in it, what it says, what it means, how to defend it. The good news is that there are lots of ways to defend it. The bad news is, the most frustrating thing about when I talk about these ideas, people say, okay, so what are the 3 things we do to fix it? Or how do I tell my anti-vax QAnon uncle? How do I persuade him? The answer is there are no simple global answers. In the past, when we've dealt with this, it's been many institutions and individuals and organizations throughout society responding in ways that are suitable to their own epistemic environment. Now, we'll come to a minute to what you can do, but here are just some of the things that have worked in the past and that we're already beginning to see take shape in the present. Now, just the beginning, we have a long way to go, but individuals are getting savvier. If people understand that they're being manipulated on Twitter, that Twitter mobs are not representative, that these are in fact small manipulative groups, they get better at dealing with it, at ignoring it, at not psychologically assimilating it. If people understand disinformation, they're better prepared for it. This is not a 100% solution by any means. These cognitive weapons are sophisticated and they're very hard to resist even if you know about them. That's why we feed the trolls, even when we know we shouldn't. But individuals getting savvier, media wising up, far more sophisticated about disinformation than they were in 2016 when they just recycled it. So, being more careful about not recycling conspiracy theories when refuting them, providing context for something like Hunter Biden's laptop, which appeared so suspiciously in something that had all the hallmarks of a classic Russian-style disinformation drop. They have correspondents now who cover disinformation. They're providing context in the article. This is all a start. Watchdogs. These are research organizations, nonprofits. Now they're in Europe, they're in America, they're in other free countries, places like the Stanford Internet Observatory, which are going inside the disinformation networks. The chat boards, where the new memes are tested, begin to be circulated. These are sophisticated people, these trolls. So they're trying all this stuff. They're working it out. But you can get inside these networks. There are even activists in Europe who are embedding themselves inside the networks and disrupting the trolls. And when these networks find these memes, these new conspiracy theories, they can try to nip them in the bud or at least get ahead of them. They tip off the social media companies, the media. They sometimes tip off governments if what's going on is illegal. Platforms responding. So social media is the bright, shiny object. People always want to talk about Facebook and social media. It is a huge problem. It is a major accelerant. But part of what I try to do in my conversations is say, it's a factor, it's not the underlying factor. If Facebook went away tomorrow, this problem would not disappear because there are so many channels that you can use these methods. That said, platforms are responding. A lot of what's going to happen here is these platforms are optimized for gathering eyeballs and advertising regardless of whether the statement being transmitted was true or false. And as we now know, sexy, conspiratorial, or funny falsehoods spread much faster than boring old truth. Platforms are now working on ways to give truth more of an advantage by changing the algorithms, by promoting and demoting. They're also working on changing the incentives. For example, Twitter will make you pause before you retweet a link that you haven't actually read. That kind of friction is crucial in the constitutional knowledge. That's the friction that slows you down. Before you circulate something, you have to maybe go through peer review. You have to go through an editor if you're a journalist. Someone's going to say to you, are you sure this fact in your law brief is right? Many other things the platforms are trying. We don't know it'll work yet, or if anything will work, but at least they're aware of the problem. Liberals are organizing. This is very important. The manipulators got the jump on us. They took us by surprise. We were not ready because we had not seen these attacks before, but we are seeing groups all across the country of many kinds counter-mobilize against cancelers and trolls. They include things like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, the Academic Freedom Alliance, there's a new group of college alumni that are going to work on free speech on campus. There are more, and the older organizations are also doing more, and that's important because so far the cancelers have met so little resistance. They will need more, and that will help even up the odds. Institutions are developing. In the past, when we've hit these kinds of problems, the key turned out to be developing institutions and bodies that could begin developing standards and guardrails, like journalistic ethics in the early 20th century, which over time, people opt into them, then target markets opt into them, and that's how we got from the yellow journalism of the late 19th century to the golden age of Edward R. Murrow and beyond in the late 20th century. We put rules in place, norms, institutions. That's what the constitutional knowledge is good at. It's very hard to do. I'm not saying it'll happen. Facebook, though, is trying to do that now with its oversight board. A lot of people scowl at that. I take it very seriously because it's the right kind of thing to try. International Association of Fact Checkers. There's now hundreds of them, and they've linked up with each other so that they can try to find out what's false, let people know about it, let the social media know about it before it gets out of hand, and so that they're not all duplicating each other's effort. Finally, civil society is mobilizing. We have to remember that these are demand-side problems, not just supply-side problems. It's not just that the disinformation is going out, it's that a lot of people love it. They want it. It gives them a heroic narrative of their own life. Well, remember, polarization and propagandization are two sides of the same coin. The more polarized and divided a society is, the more vulnerable it is to disinformation and propaganda that says the other people are the enemy, you must defeat them at all costs. That is why Vladimir Putin used his troll farm to stimulate opposing rallies across the street from each other. It is why Donald Trump tweeted out, "Liberate Michigan." The more divided we are, the more vulnerable we are to propaganda. The more propagandized we are, the more vulnerable we are. The more divided we are. You see how that spiral works. Well, you can reverse that spiral to the extent that you can begin to rebuild social trust. And groups like Braver Angels, of which I was a board member, are now conducting workshops. They've got volunteers, chapters in all 50 states, running workshops, debates. The goal here is not to change people's minds. It's to get people to de-demonize each other and learn how to talk again. And the thing that's most commonly said when people leave the room is, you know what, we're not as divided as we've been led to believe. That's a restoration of epistemic health. We have some advantages. Remember, we can build. They can only destroy. They're completely parasitic. They cannot make knowledge. We can do this. And what can you do? The last chapter I say, unmute yourself. Speak truth. Why is that important? Remember this experiment. We talked about it twice now. Let's just change a single parameter. Same 8 people in the room, 7 are actors, same question. But now, 6 of those people give the wrong answer. B, 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 B. 1 actor gives the right answer, C. Now, what does the experimental subject do? the conformity drops from 30% to 5 to 10%. It only takes one ally in the room to assure that person, maybe I'm sane after all. Maybe I can get some support from my position. It doesn't take millions and millions of people to change this. It takes each of us acting as a bloc. Some of us acting as a bloc against viral disinformation. What might that look like? Here in Arizona, a man named Stephen Richer, the Maricopa County recorder, around May decided that he had had enough of the Stop the Steal lie and the partisan audit and began speaking out. You can see that here, May 16th. Wow, this is unhinged. He began going on television, writing articles and briefs. He has now launched a political action committee to push back against the Stop the Steal candidates in Arizona. So, by the way, did the 4 Republican county supervisors of Maricopa County. All heroes, all did this at great personal and political risk. That is what it looks like to be a reality ally. It makes a difference. Stephen Richer, please stand up.
I promise I have another shirt and tie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was going to say, gee, I'm surprised Stephen Richer would want to be seen in public, but I guess he does want to be seen in public. Yeah, you'll get to see us, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm going to try to lean forward, or maybe we can push the podium back a little bit. There you go.
Thank you. So I would like to start at the beginning, so to speak, as the old song has it. The beginning is a very good place to start. For those of you interested in reading the book, we begin with the idea of encountering a great work of philosophy, which raises the question of what is it to know anything? So that this constitution of knowledge, as you sketch it, begins thousands of years ago. The quest for it begins thousands of years ago with Socrates and Plato and argument, great work. So there's a thesis here, I think. And by the way, you finish the book by naming a composite of students you've met on college campuses with this Greek name, Theaetetus, which is the character in one of Plato's dialogues and the title of the dialogue. So that the tradition can continue of learning this, as you said, doesn't come naturally. So could you talk a little bit more about the connection between an approach to education and these two constitutions as you develop it?
Well, that's a softball question to plug the School for Civic and Economic Leadership and Thought, which I'm now going to do. The founders of the U.S. Constitution told us again and again, all of them except Jefferson, who was kind of a flake, said, the written Constitution isn't enough. It might not even matter if you don't have people who have what they call civic or Republican virtue, which is they've internalized the norms of things like lawfulness, of being willing to transfer power peacefully after an election, sometimes losing, of living in a pluralistic society. If we don't have that, as Madison said, the Constitution, written Constitution, just becomes a parchment buried. So this is where my old neighbor Sandra Day O'Connor, I think, was ahead of her time. Remember, she started doing civics when she left the convention. At the time, I thought, well, that's, why is that the most important thing? Maybe she was right. If a population is not literate in the Constitution knowledge, and in the U.S. Constitution, we can't defend it. And that's why the work that you're doing, and others around the country, is just fundamental to getting this right.
The O'Connor Institute by Civics, which she helped to found, the phrase that she had at the time is this was the quiet crisis around 2010 or so.
Yeah.
But it's now become very loud crisis level. So the challenge is for a range, you talk about building and rebuilding institutions in a way, we would have to confront many institutions, including educational institutions, universities, schools, that we have taken these two constitutions for granted. We've taken the connection for granted.
Yeah.
It's not too late to rediscover it, argue about it, see why there's something there to argue about and grapple with. But right, that's a we would have to.
Yeah. When institutions work, we tend not to see them. You know, it's like we flush the toilet and the water goes away somewhere. We don't think about the massive infrastructure that makes that happen and makes the lights go on. And when institutions like the reality-based community work, they just magically produce technology and knowledge, and they tick along just fine, and we take them for granted. The problem is we took them for granted for too long. And the opponents of these systems got the jump on us. So it's a cycle. We're now going to have to go through one of these periods of rediscovering the principles behind the Constitution of Knowledge, and maybe, unfortunately, also the US Constitution. Things that we took for granted, like, for example, being willing to lose an election without saying it's rigged, or factfulness. Sticking to facts, even when, you know, you prefer some other account. I'm gay, but, you know, people say stuff like the Stonewall riots were led by trans people of color. That's not true. People wish it were true. Maybe I wish it were true, but it's not. So we've got to be factful. We've got to begin restoring, I think, more viewpoint diversity in academia. Being more careful about not being politicized, being better about free speech on campus, really open debate to reduce this chilling problem. We're going to have to rediscover and rebuttress the principles of the Constitution of Knowledge, and that's a hard thing to do.
You mentioned free speech, intellectual diversity. That was basically the title of our. Carol, was that the first year or the second year? Was that the first year? The first year. So let me ask you a little bit more about that. Your earlier book, Kindly Inquisitors, right? Different kind of inquisition, kind inquisitors, focusing on free speech. This is from more than a decade ago, right? The difference in this book is to go deeper into the development over hundreds, even thousands of years of these two constitutions. But I want to mention a pretty striking phrase. What I think of as a minority point of view in the current higher education environment, other elite institutions. You say that intellectual diversity is as important or even more important than demographic diversity for the Constitution of Knowledge. So higher education, other educational knowledge-forming institutions need to take intellectual diversity as seriously as demographic diversity.
It,
say a little bit more
it needs to be co-equal. Madison's Constitution, Madison had a really big problem, which he knew about from studying other democracies, which is democracies tend to be captured by factions, whether it's a majority faction that uses its power to oppress minorities, or whether they're minority factions which manage to take control in different ways. What do you do about the problem of factions? He says, well, you can't prevent them from lobbying and voting. He says you extend the sphere. This is another new idea. Madison's an alien from outer space. He's such a genius. He says you bring in more and more groups. You enlarge the democracy to the point where no one group can take control, and then you pit them against each other. And it's out of this dynamic process of forcing these many factions in a pluralistic society to compromise that you get both the creativity and the dynamism, but also the stability over the long term. And it works surprisingly well. Constitution of Knowledge. So I don't see my biases. I'm never going to see my biases. And if I'm in a room with people who share my biases, we won't see our biases. And we could all be scientists and think we're doing the best research possible and we're having robust debate and criticism. But in fact, because no one's there to challenge our premises and say, have you thought about X or Y, we're in an echo chamber. We're hearing each other back. The whole system, Constitution of Knowledge, requires three things to it. Yes, free speech, crucial. That's the input. To get the output right, you need the discipline of fact. That's those many incentives and structures and institutions that mean that Paul over here can't make up his footnotes. He's got to get it right. And the third is diversity of belief. You've got to have enough different points of view in the room on any given subject so that you can be pretty sure that there will be adequate challenges to find our errors. So when I see entire sectors of the academic world, entire disciplines departments where it's possible now for a person to go through their whole academic training and then on into the professor without encountering a political conservative, for example. That's a situation that is not conducive to doing good, unbiased research. So we need to do a better job. I think the same is true in journalism. We need to do a better job of reducing the barriers to viewpoint diversity, making conservatives feel welcome, finding, identifying where discrimination is happening against viewpoint diversity on campus. There are new studies out. We have the data now. Discrimination, viewpoint diversity, discrimination is rampant in academia. We need to start fixing that. And I think, yes, it needs to be co-equal with other forms of diversity. It's at least as important.
Another hard thing that you say in the book is that formerly disadvantaged viewpoints and groups who have suffered real harm historically, and you identify yourself as gay, one of those, have to be, they ought to take seriously your view that they shouldn't, for their own benefit, just say, we have been harmed in the past, and there's certain views we shouldn't have to hear. And there's certain speakers, ideas that we should not have to hear in a university setting, school settings, and other settings, because then that means we are not safe, we're not valued, we're not equal. And you have the hard response to that. No, that's not good for you, your self-identified group, or your viewpoint, and it's not good for this whole constitutional knowledge. So would you address that?
Yeah, it's a big subject and one close to my heart. You know, I'm a gay American. I was born in 1960, very different time. We couldn't work for the government, serve in the military, be a government contractor that required a security clearance. We were beaten on the streets. We were reviled from the pulpits. We were considered clinically insane. We were total pariahs. And the reason that I'm now married to a man was freedom of speech and freedom of thought, because the people with the unsafe views for most of my life were us. We were the homosexuals who were out to recruit America's children, bring God's wrath down on the country. And the notion that we would now say that we are too weak to encounter negative views about homosexuality is patronizing. We will not melt if we have to confront, say, the Orthodox Catholic who says homosexuality is intrinsically disordered. That's Catholic doctrine right now. You may think it's hate speech, but that's what the Pope says. We will not melt. In fact, a society which protects hate speech is always safer for minorities and dissidents than a society that tries to protect us from hate speech. Because the people who are actually executing the rules, running the society, making the decisions about what can be said and not said, those will either be majoritarian, in which case minorities will suffer, or they'll be authoritarian, in which case minorities will suffer even more. So I argue, and have always argued, that free thought, free speech, open inquiry, and the constitution of knowledge, which reveals truth, which undermines the basis of hate, that is our truest friend and ally. And it breaks my heart to see so many minority rights activists, including LGBT activists, turn against freedom of thought, freedom of speech.
Well, one last question for me, and then we have a microphone here, so time for some questions from the audience. I want to finish with one other paradox. The book is full of paradoxes or difficult things to put together. You just talked about some of them, but it's the paradox you cite. You don't call it paradox, but you cite a speech that Abraham Lincoln gives in 1838, worried about the beginning of this downward spiral, in effect. This is your phrasing, these are constitutions, but he's worried that violence is breaking out about morally important subjects, slavery and abolition, and gambling and liquor and these things. And he argues that this shows a deficit of learning and education. What's the root cause, right? We are not teaching enough about respect for the rule of law, the laws, the Constitution. And you say this is Lincoln's argument to balance both reverence and reason. We have to have a fundamental respect, and institutions and schools and families should have fundamental reverence and regard. But also you reason and you argue. So on page 118 of the book, The Declaration of Independence is history's greatest summons to liberty, and the Constitution is history's greatest governing document. So you yourself have, these are immense achievements in all of human civilization. But of course, what they set up is the freedom to argue. No, they're not. Right? So talk a little bit about this. You have regard for this achievement, these two achievements, these two constitutions. But they're open to argument and criticism as well, and that's a rich educational approach.
The wonderful thing about the reality-based community, there are a lot of wonderful things about it, but one of the most elegant and magical is it constantly argues about itself. That's how it corrects errors along the way. And that's part of the process. What's true, what's not true, how should the system work? Scientists talk about good and bad scientists, the replication crisis. That's a feature, not a bug. But here's the thing. You need to follow the rules when you do that. You can't be doing that in a way that's, for example, undermining the system by trying to get anyone who disagrees with you fired from their job. But if you're doing the work of criticizing the rules from within the rules, this actually turns out to work remarkably well. In the US Constitution, it's how we evolved constitutional principles. None of us would want to live under the Constitution as it was written and originally implemented for obvious reasons, especially, but not only if you're a woman, an African American, or in fact a gay person. How do we change that? Through the constitutional argument. How do we improve the Constitution of knowledge? Through the epistemic argument, but you got to follow the rules.
And the
And as
Constitution,
Lincoln said, you got to imbibe those rules. You got to feel them, not just think them.
and one of the rules is amendment, right? One of the rules is self-amending in the original Constitution. The humility, you talk about this, the humility to say, we think this is good. We don't claim that it's perfect.
Yeah, and happens all the time. People discover the flaws of certain kinds of experiments and begin to develop better methods like randomized controlled trials.
Okay, well, we have some time for questions from the audience. Our normal rules apply. We ask you to keep it brief and that your question is actually a question. So go ahead.
Yes. Hello. So in your recent statements here, you were talking about how Madison talked about you should throw around as many different ideas as you want, different viewpoints as you want. But in American politics today, generally what we see is predominantly two main viewpoints. From what I understand, most other European countries with similar systems have more than two viable parties. Now, do you have any idea of how we might get more diversity of thought? I've got some of my own ideas on this, but I'd like to know if you have any ideas of how we might change the system to be more inclusive of, like, outside what they call the Overton window. So.
Yeah, the Overton window is sort of the limits of accepted discourse. I actually think that both historically, maybe not right at this minute, but historically, the two parties have been pretty good at bringing in new ideas. Sometimes you needed third parties sort of pushing to do it. But they were both coalitions, right? You had the libertarians, the supply-siders, the Chamber of Commerce people, the social conservatives in the Republican Party. You had the progressives, the unions, the New Dealers, and so forth in the Democratic Party. And it was their contention internally that brought those ideas in. So I'm actually not of the view that the two-party system itself squelches diversity. I am worried now about the condition, particularly of the Republican Party, where one faction is so dominant in controlling the primary system that it is very hard for other voices to be heard. There are people talking about third parties and proportional representation. That's probably a conversation, not for today, but you might look at Lee Drutman's book, I think published last year or the year before, which makes the case for multi-party system and proportional representation as a way to do more of that work of introducing those voices.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for your talk. I thought it was very informative. I just wanted to ask you about the wing of the Republican Party, which is dominant now. It seems to me that given the closed universe of it, they get their news from very selective sources. They don't really allow information to come in from all these other areas because they disavowed them. They don't believe the press, they don't believe any of the institutions. how are your solutions for bringing the constitution of knowledge to those folks? Can that really work, or do we have a bigger problem?
Well, it's a big problem. It's worked in the past, but there's no guarantees this time around. Remember, though, 40% of the public believe in demonic possession, 25% in astrology, UFOs. There's always been lots of strange and false beliefs in America. You don't need to get everyone. You don't want to get everyone believing the same thing. You want diversity of opinion, and that's going to include some pretty weird stuff. What you do need is a critical mass of people who agree enough about policies so that you can govern. So being a Christian Scientist, well, maybe that's not a good example. I won't use an example. There are lots of peculiar things people can believe that won't directly impact the functioning of a democracy. Unfortunately, that Donald Trump is the rightful president, won the election, and should be installed right now is not one of them. So what we need to focus on is building a critical mass of agreement, consensus on some of those core things. And that's hard to do, but I think the kinds of things I've talked about are steps in the right direction. Remember, these are minority views that we're talking about. They've been able to project themselves to look much more dominant than they really are, but these are not majority points of view that we're up against. So what we're trying to do is consolidate a larger scale of mainstream opinion, which is fact-based. It's hard, but not impossible.
In the United States, the defender of last resort are the armed services. So can we rely on them to do the right thing, or are they vulnerable to manipulation too?
I don't know. I've never been asked that question. I think that they've done very well in some of the trials they faced over the past 4 years, but not perfectly. We know that there are people, individuals in the armed forces who are responding to conspiracy theories. I don't think they're a majority. And that is not the first institution that I would look at as problematic. But maybe. I haven't done the research. Yeah.
Next question.
Yes. So you mentioned that you think people tend to, or if I interpreted this right, that people tend to over-attribute the social ills to social media, which I don't think anybody would dispute. But it seems that it has inspired a level of isolation and distrust that we haven't seen before, because we're not required to interact with people actually physically around us. It's so easy to pull out your phone and interact with people who are physically distant, but we're much easier to interact with. So what are your thoughts on that as it relates to the Constitution?
So it's, I walk this difficult line because I sure don't want to be dismissive of digital media. It's not just social media, it's also Google search, all kinds of stuff, that have these very peculiar incentives to maximize eyeballs regardless of the social cost. And I don't want to minimize that. I don't want to say that's not a problem, go focus on other things. On the other hand, I'm trying to get people to focus on some of those other things. So I think we increasingly know that these flaws in digital media are causing some of the harms that we're talking about today, or at least accelerating them. They're acting as accelerants in the fire. I don't know about you. I'd love to hear ideas in the room. I have seen a lot of interesting ideas. Everything from tweaking the algorithms or letting people choose their own algorithms to more transparency, to public alternatives to these platforms. All kinds of ideas are out there. The answer, I think, is that we're at the beginning of a process of trial and error, which is going to have to go on for a while in order to figure out if we can master these tools before they master us. I don't think at the front end of the process we know how this works. But I also want to highlight something that you said that I think is important. You talk about loneliness, disaffection. Remember, these social media platforms aren't operating in a vacuum. They're operating in a society which over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a documented decline in social capital. That's people's connectedness to each other, their sense of trust in each other, their trust in the institutions that protect them and bind them together. This is something that SCETL talks a lot about, something that Tocqueville talked a lot about. So we also have to work the other side of the equation, the social pressures and the social atomization that is feeding the demand and causing the loneliness. That's why I'm so keen on civic organizations like Braver Angels and others. And I think we need to work that into the problem just as vigorously.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question.
I think we've got time for these three more.
So can I ask 2 questions?
Just one.
Okay. So, would you say like open-mindedness is like the biggest thing that we have to accomplish right now?
Yes and no. When I meet an unfamiliar idea, even if it's offensive, actually especially if it's offensive, I try to make my reaction, what can I learn from this, instead of how can I make this go away? And I do worry that your generation of students has less of that ethic. On the other hand, something we know from sociology of science is that scientists are human and they're just as dogmatic as anyone else. And you need these firm ideas, these strong beliefs, yes, I'm right, and Carice here is wrong, to drive forward this very difficult process that often takes 20 years to get your idea heard. You've just got to pound away. You got to be sure you're right. So the key thing, yeah, you want people to be willing to entertain other ideas, and you want them not to shut down the other ideas. You don't want them to shout them down, to drown them out, to flood the zone with shit, to censor them. But you can't make individuals be open-minded all the time. It's really about having a system that's open-minded, I think.
Thank you.
A friend of mine has every single belief he has. I have a different belief.
And your friends.
He's a great friend of mine. He's also a Christian minister. He believes in creationism. Everything he believes in, I don't. But he's an expert on communications. He's a great pastor. He's a great communicator of ideas. And I talked to him this morning, and he said the most important thing to learn to communicate is to listen.
Thank you. There's a lot of research that bears that out. A question about the uncle who disagrees with you about everything. Bombarding them with facts typically doesn't work. What does work is to come alongside as an ally, to ask questions, to show curiosity. There's a great quotation that I've heard attributed to Dale Carnegie, though I haven't checked it, and it's this: you cannot make people agree with you, but you can make people want to agree with you. And that's where it begins.
Well, and we just happen to have Theatitas at the microphone. Jonah, the last question.
Yeah, so the question I had is with regard to the final response you gave to Dr. Carice on the idea of not breaking the rules and trying to fix the rules, but I have a concern with regards to issues of institutional capture. So if an institution is at that point where you can't real seriously work within the system, is there a point where you think it is permissible to break the rules, to fix the rules, or rather I should say, and in addition to, on what grounds should the destruction of an institution be a valid alternative?
So breaking institutions is pretty much a last resort that doesn't work. The good thing about liberal social systems is they've been pretty good at self-correcting over time, not invariably, but they've been pretty good at it. So I think there is still, in terms of the Constitution of knowledge, I see a lot of problems, but I don't yet see institutions in the big four, academia, journalism, law, and government, that are so irreparably broken that we need to throw them away and start over, nor could we if we tried. So I think the job that we're stuck with is, in fact, reforming and improving. And the good news is I think we're seeing a growing number of people within the institutions are starting to understand those problems and starting to work on them. An example would be Heterodox Academy, a group of professors, and they're from every ideological background, who are now working on the problem of increasing viewpoint diversity in academia. And they're doing that as scientists, as researchers, as professors, saying we need to get our house in order. There's comparable movement in journalism. There's not enough. There's a long way to go. But I typically favor the inside game. And I think that you can be part of that, and that we all can. We're going to leave this room and go back to whatever our institutions are. And we need to look for ways in which we can improve them, strengthen the Constitution of knowledge, and be a bulwark in a reality-based community. And most of us will find that there's at least one thing that we can do in the institutions we care about.
Great. Thank you so much. So I have a few closing remarks. Don't fall asleep, and then the reception. I'm standing between you and the reception. So as I mentioned before, especially the students here, but if you're someone who cares about students, there's plenty of information outside about the kinds of degrees we have. We're starting a new certificate in philosophy, politics, and economics, PPE. We hope you'll get information on the schedule of events we have in the Civic Discourse Project for the rest of the year. I mentioned the theme, Renewing America's Civic Compact. On November 15th, we have the person who claims to have invented the phrase social capital, Glenn Lowry, economist from Brown University, debating Khalil Muhammad from Harvard University, debate dialogue, so dialogue. The first of a series of special events we're going to do on the theme, Can We Talk Honestly About Race in America? With the theme of civil disagreement on that contentious topic. So that's November 15th. Thanks to many people, but as Jonathan already mentioned, Dr. Carol McNamara is Associate Director of the School for Public Programs. The team of people working with Carol, including Morgan Raddick, our events coordinator manager, Marcia Brookie, our communications manager, student workers, others. We have the best team at Arizona State University for these kinds of events. Thanks to Arizona PBS for their partnership with us. And speaking of Arizona PBS, we have had a podcast in the past called Keeping It Civil. And now that we're doing live events again, we're bringing that back. So look for that. We're going to start the series in partnership with Arizona PBS, the Keeping It Civil series of podcasts, probably in January. And so with that, thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing you at other live events in the Civic Discourse Project. We hope you'll stay for the reception. And please join me one last time in thanking Jonathan Rauch.
We haven't stopped.
Thank you for coming. Come again.
So, stick with me. Yeah.